And we have just heard that Germany's SPD has voted in favour of a grand coalition, and therefore, in effect, from about now, Germany does again have a government. And so to the papers, as usual. The Observer's got a very interesting story here about the economic cost of the snow. £1 billion a day, building sites not working, shops empty, and so on. A really big, significant hit, which will affect the quarterly figures, they say. They've also got one of the critics of that speech, one of the relatively few critics of the May speech, Michael Heseltine, writing in the paper as well. The Mail on Sunday has a story about Boris Johnson and dirty tricks, described by Number 10 this morning with an old-fashioned Anglo-Saxon word I don't think I can regale you with. The Sunday Telegraph has a story about BBC stars complaining over their taxes, these service companies and so forth. And also they've got a story there about the abolition of a whole lot of rules as soon as Brexit happens. And then finally there's the Sunday Times, a story about internet giants profiting from pop-up brothels. There's a lot of stories attacking internet companies these days in the newspapers, and inside the paper, Lord Hall of the BBC is joining in today, talking about the social cohesion effect of Netflix and Amazon and all of that. But we are going to start, of course, with Theresa May's big speech, Ian Dale. And in a sense, what's odd is the lack of front-page stories.
Which means it's job done, I guess, for the Prime Minister. You've got a couple of editorials in the papers which are quite revealing, because the Mail on Sunday, not a huge fan of Theresa May normally, they conclude their editorial with the words, "Mrs May has brought a very divided cabinet together. She deserves support so the hard work of getting the best possible deal can begin." Now, the Observer's editorial is slightly different, as you might imagine. The future that May is leading us towards will make Britain a poorer, meaner place. Well, poorer, you could argue that, meaner, I'm not quite sure their logic there. But there aren't huge numbers of Tory critics coming out today, even anonymously, to criticise it.
There's been a big operation going on by Number 10, hasn't there?
Before the speech, I think they got a lot of people on side. Jacob Rees-Mogg's reaction to the speech was incredibly positive, which I was slightly surprised at. Even Nicky Morgan, one of her main critics on the backbenches, was in favour. And the only grandee that the Observer can drag out is Michael Heseltine, who has been critical, but he's about the only one.
Well, there's John Major, I guess, in the Mail on Sunday as well. He made a very, very strong anti-Brexit speech before Theresa May, but he's mainly focusing on the Irish border today.
Yeah, and it ought to be something which is kind of a crashingly banal thing to say, which is we can't take peace for granted. And this is within a lifetime of people who are still alive that these problems were there. But nonetheless, I mean, that speech was, you know, there's two ways of looking at it. Either it was such an excellent speech, it shut down all possible criticism, or it kicked the can further down the road, and therefore it's just put off those arguments a little bit further. I mean, I do think there was a kind of slight application of low expectations from that speech. And there was a moment when she started talking about data protection regulations that I really began to question my life choices in joining political journalism. But, you know, it did have some meat in it. You know, there's talk about the agencies that we're going to stay into, for example.
She was very clear that we are not going to get the same kind of access to European markets after Brexit. So this exact same benefits phrase has gone. And she was very clear we will be paying in money, and she was very clear there will be lots of areas in which the European Court will still have some effect on British life.
In a sense, this was a speech that she should have delivered a year ago, but she couldn't deliver it a year ago because a lot of the more hardline Eurosceptics would not have swallowed some of this, particularly the things that you've just been talking about.
Can I ask you about why they have been so quiet this morning and yesterday? Is it because, perhaps, they realise their best chance of getting Brexit actually done and the deal signed is to keep Theresa May there, get her to do it, and then after that they can move her to one side and put in one of them and get the kind of real divergence Brexit they've always wanted?
I think there is something in that. I think the other thing, her biggest strength is that there is nobody that is just ready and willing to, well, there are lots of people ready and willing to take over, but there's no sort of king or queen over the water. As there was with sort of Heseltine in Margaret Thatcher's days. So I think it would be, they couldn't come to an agreement on who the best rival should be.
I also think there was a way that speech set out the idea that we will have all these powers, it's just we might not necessarily use them immediately. So it was a kind of offer to the idea that another Prime Minister in future could pull us further back.
That's going to be a problem when it comes to the EU, because if she's saying, here's my view, we're not going to diverge very much, it's going to carry on being the same, you can relax, they now know that that's only as long as she's Prime Minister. You know, Prime Minister Rees-Mogg or Prime Minister Gove or whoever it might be will take a very, very different view, and that will affect their attitude to this negotiation.
There's always the... if you think a week ago, and a week is a long time in politics, so it was, what, 10 days ago the Chequers summit happened, and we were told that at that summit they'd all agreed there would be regulatory divergence. Well, when you listen to Theresa May's speech, there was none of that language in there. Now, either it was the sort of Boris Johnson's briefing immediately after that, the wrong thing, or Ollie Robbins, her chief Sherpa, had influenced her to row back on it.
Let's move to another really big story which directly affects this one, which is Donald Trump and his blast against the EU and cars, his quite protectionist blast overnight. Well, and you have a tweet from the president.
I mean, as ever, we just comment on it on his tweets. He says if the EU wants to further increase their already massive tariffs and barriers on US companies doing business there, we'll simply add a tax on their cars. Now, this is the politics of the gut. It's not the politics of the brain, and this is what we, I suppose, are used to with Donald Trump. But he clearly, having imposed these tariffs on steel, is clearly thinking about doing it in other areas.
So you could play this two ways when it comes to Brexit. You could say, what a crazy time to be going out trying to do free trade deals at the moment when China is being very menacing, and there's lots of that in the papers, and we have an American president who is sounding increasingly protectionist. Or you could say, better to be outside the EU bloc if the Americans are going to treat the EU this way. And
I think that's a very optimistic reading. You know, the EU is a big trading bloc, and we will not necessarily be a smaller one. But this is very interesting. You know, Jeremy Corbyn's speech on Brexit, which he talked on Monday about a customs union, he was also talking about the problems of, you know, the chlorine chicken, the famous chlorinated chicken that comes over from the US.
Why are we so obsessed by chlorinated
because
chicken?
It's horrible and no one wants to eat it.
What do people eat when they go to the US? They will eat that there and not notice the difference. I've never understood this complete obsession with this subject.
Strong defence of American food. That's a big, big thing to take on.
OK, let's move on to another big story overnight, which is what the Conservatives are doing about housing.
Yeah, I mean, if I had a pound for every time the Conservatives have promised a housing revolution, then I'd be a lot richer than I am now. But there is a problem here. They're talking about this idea about building a corridor between Oxford and Cambridge, about new towns, essentially. What they want to do is relax planning rules. The question is whether or not actually they will allow councils to build themselves. I think the question is whether or not there is the will to build there. But look, there is a problem when they say we're going to take on NIMBYs, because there's another word for NIMBYs, and that's Tory voters. You know, Labour did very well at the last election with people in the private rental sector who've seen rents go up enormously, but homeowners largely vote Tory.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about culture wars in politics with Ian, who I have to say has rather worryingly raised the bar when it comes to male grooming on this programme with that great jacket.
How very kind. I didn't dare wear the trousers, but anyway. This is a story about Munro Bergdorf, who's been appointed as an equalities advisor by Dawn Butler, Labour's shadow equalities minister. And on the face of it, it does seem a slightly bizarre appointment when you look at some of the things that she's said in the past. However, the Mail on Sunday have got hold of some tweets that she sent to some friends of hers in 2012, which, if you just take them completely out of context, they look terrible. But I think we've all tweeted things to our friends that, in hindsight, if you in public, don't look particularly brilliant. So I've got a slight bit of sympathy with her on that front. However, in this interview in the Mail on Sunday Style magazine, she says this: "I practice witchcraft. It's something I've always been attracted to, and I like it because it's female-centric." And you think, and also she says, I'm black and
voodoo is more my culture than Christianity.
Absolutely, and then she also says, well, I don't understand how you can be conservative and gay. All conservatives are racist. Well, I'd love to actually have a meeting with her to explain how you can be gay and conservative.
Yes, of course.
I find it a very worrying story because it feels to me as if she's been appointed purely on the basis of her identity, and I think that's actually quite offensive to the equalities agenda, which is something I feel quite strongly about. You know, as a woman doesn't make you an expert on feminism, as a transgender person doesn't make you an expert on transgender rights. So it does feel like a very tokenistic appointment by Labour.
OK, now I want to keep moving to some of the foreign stories as well, I'm afraid, because it's a very, very big day in foreign news, and I'm going to go to Italy next, because overnight we're going to get the Italian election results. They're voting, I think, today, aren't they, Ian?
Yes, they are.
And there's a real possibility of the anti-Brussels, anti-immigration, five-star movement beginning to really move towards power.
Yeah, it's quite difficult to work out with the Italian electoral system whether they will actually be able to get power. They've always said they wouldn't enter into coalitions, but they've got a 31-year-old very geeky leader who I think is softening on that a little bit. The biggest bloc will be the one that's effectively led by Silvio Berlusconi, but he obviously can't become Prime Minister for reasons...
He's barred from public
office,
office, right?
bongo reasons, and many others as well. But this is yet another example of a renegade political party really being able to influence the political agenda. You've got the AfD in Germany, you have UKIP here, and this means if the right in Italy does as well as everyone says, it effectively means that Britain will be the only country where the sort of hard left is really on the march. You look across all of Europe, and it's the right that are doing it.
But I mean, if the Five Star Movement actually took power, which is possible, that would be a much bigger blow to Brussels than Brexit. I mean, that would be huge.
Up to a point.
To have a
I don't mean to make boasts about the size of Britain versus Italy or their relative importance to the European project, but I think there probably is a stage. I mean, the best thing about reading...
Italy was there at the start.
It's true, but reading about Italian politics is the one thing you need to do to cheer you up about British politics, because it's
all right.
crazy.
OK, let's talk about Chinese politics now, because another important thing is going to happen tomorrow, which is the Chinese Communist Party is going to tear up the rules about how long President Xi can carry on being president. Yeah, and this piece in the Sunday Times makes the point that actually some of the reforms to try and transition China more towards democracy have been put off because saying, well, look, you know, OK, we don't need to do these, but someone can only be in power for 10 years. Well, that's now being eroded. And as Ian says, there is always a Trump tweet for something, and there's a Trump, you know, there's a private comments by Trump, which I'm sure he will tweet about later, saying, wouldn't this be a great idea if America did this too? So we are in an age in which people are, you know, incredibly authoritarian. You have these big figures. I mean, Berlusconi is another one. They kind of like zombies come back again. They will not, you know, leave public life. Vladimir Putin being another one who's switched around between Prime Minister and President. So this is a kind of return to the age of strongmen, I think, in politics. What fun. What fun. Now, there's been a lot of discussion about cabinet ministers and their favourite childhood books. People have been getting into trouble. I need to ask what your favourite book is, Ian.
Well, this is in the Sunday Times. Philip Hammond, the Chancellor, you would have thought he might have used this as an opportunity to appear a little bit more human, a little bit more funny. 1984 by George Orwell was his favourite childhood book. I was kind of thinking more Magic Faraway Tree. That was my favourite as a child.
The works of Terry Pratchett I would highly recommend, and being, you know, appropriate to childhood and adolescence.
Boris Johnson, The Iliad.
Of course. Thank you both very, very much. Jolly interesting. And so to the weather, which has